Have you ever looked at someone's hands and realized they tell a story words can't? There's this moment in Season 1, Episode 1, Days Gone By, when Rick Grimes wakes from his coma and his hands are clean, pale, trembling slightly as he reaches for the hospital bed rail. Sheriff's hands. Civilized hands. And then there's Season 9, Episode 5, when Rick's on that bridge, and his hands are covered in blood and dirt and walker gore, gripping the detonator that'll blow the bridge and save everyone. Same hands, same man, unrecognizable journey between them. And I keep coming back to those hands, to that transformation, because they make me wonder, when did Rick stop being good? Or was he never good to begin with? Was Rick's arc a moral descent? Or was it something else entirely, a shedding of illusions, a brutal education in what survival actually costs? Tonight, let's trace Rick Grimes' journey from small-town sheriff to the man who tore a throat out with his teeth, not to condemn him or praise him, just to understand what happened to the good man who woke up alone in that hospital. Settle in. This one's about morality, violence, and the impossible question of whether goodness can survive the apocalypse. Rick Grimes enters the apocalypse in Season 1 as the embodiment of pre-outbreak morality. He's a sheriff, a protector, someone who believes in law and order and doing the right thing. And Rick's first interaction with a walker, that little girl in the pilot episode, it's telling. Rick sees her from behind, thinks she's a survivor, approaches gently, and when she turns and Rick sees she's a walker, Rick hesitates. He doesn't want to shoot. He apologizes to her, says, "I'm sorry this happened to you," before he pulls the trigger. That apology, that hesitation, that's Rick's entire moral framework in one moment. Rick believes that even monsters deserve dignity, that violence should be reluctant, that killing, even mercy killing, requires remorse. And throughout Season 1, Rick maintains that framework. Rick's the voice of reason in the Atlanta group. When the group debates, leaving Merle handcuffed on the roof, Rick argues for going back for him. Even though Merle's racist and violent and dangerous, Rick believes you don't leave people behind, even bad people, because that's what separates you from the monsters. When Jim gets bitten and asks to be left by the road to die, Rick honors that request, sits with Jim, treats him with respect. Rick's operating from a moral code that says people matter, individual lives matter, and you don't compromise that code even when it's inconvenient. The emotional anchor here is that Rick enters the apocalypse believing goodness still matters. Rick thinks that if the survivors can maintain their pre-outbreak morality, maintain their humanity, then maybe civilization isn't lost. Maybe they can rebuild something better. And Rick's entire Season 1 arc is him trying to hold on to that belief while the world keeps proving him wrong. The CDC fails, Jenner commits suicide and nearly kills everyone. Shane's getting more brutal, more pragmatic, and Shane's methods work. And Rick's watching, learning, starting to doubt whether his moral code is sustainable. The theory I'm working with is that Rick starts good by any conventional definition, compassionate, ethical, reluctant to use violence. But the apocalypse doesn't reward goodness. The apocalypse rewards pragmatism, speed, ruthlessness. And Rick's going to learn that lesson over and over until he either adapts or dies. And the question hovering over everything is, when Rick adapts, when he becomes more pragmatic and ruthless, does that make him bad? Or does it just make him realistic? Is Rick losing his goodness? Or is he letting go of a naive morality that was going to get everyone killed? Here's what I want you to think about. Is pre-apocalypse morality even applicable after the outbreak? Because Rick's trying to apply sheriff's ethics to a world without law, without infrastructure, without consequences for violence, beyond immediate retaliation. Rick's trying to be the good guy in a world that's killed all the good guys. And that's noble, maybe. But it's also dangerous. Because while Rick's hesitating, apologizing to walkers, being merciful and ethical. Other people are being faster, harder, more willing to do what's necessary. And Rick's about to learn that the hard way. Rick's first kill is Mercy, a little girl walker who was probably someone's daughter, someone's sister, turned into a monster through no fault of her own. And Rick treats that kill with the gravity it deserves. But it's also the last time Rick's violence will be that clean, that clearly justified, that morally unambiguous. Because from here on, Rick's kills get murkier, the threats get more human, and Rick's gonna have to decide, over and over, whether being good is more important than keeping people alive. And I think we already know which he'll choose. We just don't know what it'll cost him. Shane Walsh is Rick's mirror, his shadow, the version of Rick that adapted to the apocalypse faster and more completely. And throughout seasons 1 and 2, Shane's pushing Rick to be harder, more pragmatic, more willing to make brutal calls. Shane's famous speech in season 2 goes something like, "You can't be the good guy anymore, Rick. That's how you get people killed." And Shane's not entirely wrong. Shane's methods, his willingness to kill Otis to save Carl, his insistence on killing Randall rather than risking the group's safety, they're brutal, but they're also effective in the short term. And Rick keeps rejecting Shane's way. Rick wants to save Randall, wants to give him a chance, believes you don't just execute people without trial. Rick wants to believe Herschel's right that the walkers in the barn can be cured, or at least that killing them should be done respectfully, not massacred like Shane does. Rick's clinging to his pre-outbreak morality, his belief that there are lines you don't cross, rules you follow even when it's hard, and people keep dying. Sophia's dead in the barn. Dale dies arguing for mercy, and Shane's getting more frustrated, more certain that Rick's going to get everyone killed with his hesitation and his ethics. The barn massacre in Season 2, Episode 7, Pretty Much Dead Already, is the clearest example of Rick versus Shane's philosophies colliding. Shane opens the barn and shoots all of Herschel's Walker family, proving they're not curable, they're just dead things. And Rick's horrified, not just by the violence, but by what it represents. The complete abandonment of hope that things can go back to normal, that the walkers are still people worth saving. And then Sophia stumbles out as the final walker, and Rick's the one who shoots her, and Shane's point is made. Rick's mercy, Rick's belief in Herschel's way, it didn't save Sophia, it just prolonged everyone's denial. And Rick's starting to realize Shane might be right. The emotional anchor is that Shane's the man Rick might need to become. Shane's adapted. Shane's let go of pre-outbreak morality, embraced survival-first ethics, and Shane's still functioning, still protecting people, still making the hard calls Rick won't make. And Rick's watching Shane, seeing Shane's effectiveness, and starting to understand that maybe goodness is a luxury he can't afford. Maybe being the good guy does get people killed, like Shane said. And maybe Rick needs to become more like Shane to keep Carl and Lori alive. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes across seasons 1 and 2 is that good leaders fail and pragmatic ones survive. Jim dies because the group respects his wish to be left behind mercy, but also a loss of a capable survivor. Dale dies arguing for Randall's life, killed by a walker while alone. Herschel almost loses the farm because he's too compassionate, won't kill walkers, believes they can be saved. And Shane, brutal and pragmatic, he keeps people alive through sheer ruthlessness. And Rick's learning from this. Rick's watching the good people die and the hard people survive, and Rick's starting to make a calculation, and then Rick kills Shane in Season 2's finale. Not in self-defense, not exactly. Shane draws on Rick, forces the confrontation, but Rick manipulates the situation, baits Shane, ensures they're alone so Rick can handle it without witnesses. And Rick stabs Shane, kills his best friend, and Carl shoots Walker Shane. And Rick's crossed a line. Rick's killed someone who was human, was threatening him, but was also family, was someone Rick could have talked down, could have restrained, could have handled non-lethally, and Rick chose the lethal option. Rick chose Shane's way, and there's no going back. Here's the thing that haunts me about Rick and Shane. Every time Rick rejects Shane's way, people die. Sophia dies while Rick's searching for her with hope instead of pragmatism. Dale dies arguing for mercy. And when Rick finally embraces Shane's methods, when Rick becomes the hard, pragmatic leader Shane said he needed to be, people survive. The group escapes the farm. They take the prison. They start building something. And the cost is Rick's goodness, Rick's belief that he can be the good guy, because Rick's learning what Shane tried to teach him. In the apocalypse, the good guy dies first, and Rick's choosing not to die. He's choosing to become Shane. And once you become Shane, once you embrace that brutality, can you ever go back? Or is that transformation permanent? Rick's about to find out. The prison arc in Season 3 is where Rick stops being good by his own Season 1 standards. And the moment it happens, the exact moment, is when Rick kills Tomas. Tomas is one of the prisoners already in the prison when Rick's group arrives, and Tomas is dangerous, aggressive, challenges Rick's authority. And during a walker clearing mission, Tomas tries to kill Rick by pushing walkers at him, nearly gets Rick killed. And Rick, immediately after they're safe, he confronts Tomas. And Tomas is tense, but not actively attacking, when Rick swings a machete into his head, kills him instantly, brutally, not self-defense, preemptive violence. Rick killing a threat before the threat can materialize into an attack. And that's new. That's different from everything Rick's done before. Rick's killed walkers, killed Shane in a confrontation Shane initiated. But Tomas isn't actively trying to kill Rick when Rick strikes. Tomas is dangerous, yes. Tomas will probably try to kill Rick again, yes. But in that moment, Tomas is just standing there. And Rick kills him anyway. And the other prisoners, they're terrified. They've just watched Rick execute someone for being a potential threat, not an active one. And Rick's okay with their fear. Rick wants them afraid. Rick's learned that fear keeps people in line, keeps them from challenging him, keeps them alive by keeping them obedient. The evidence that this is Rick's moral turning point is in how Rick acts afterward. Rick doesn't apologize, doesn't explain, doesn't justify. Rick just locks the other prisoners in a yard full of walkers and walks away, leaves them to die. And when one prisoner survives and runs after Rick's group, Rick doesn't welcome him. Rick's suspicious, cold, barely tolerant. Rick's become someone who sees threats everywhere and eliminates them preemptively. Someone who'd rather kill 10 innocent people than risk one guilty person surviving to hurt his family. The emotional anchor is that Rick's choosing safety over mercy. Rick's decided that protecting his group requires killing anyone who might threaten them, not waiting to see if they actually will. And that's a fundamental shift. That's Rick abandoning the innocent until proven guilty ethics of his sheriff days and embracing guilty by association, or even guilty by potential. Rick's no longer trying to save people. Rick's trying to eliminate threats, and everyone's a potential threat. The theory is that this is the moment Rick stops being good by his own Season 1 standards. Season 1, Rick would have tried to talk to Tomas, would have restrained him, would have exiled him at worst. Season 3, Rick just kills him and doesn't lose sleep over it. And the question is Rick wrong? Because Tomas probably would have tried to kill Rick again. The other prisoners probably would have caused problems. Rick's preemptive violence probably saved lives. But it also killed people who hadn't actually committed the crimes Rick killed them for. They'd only thought about it, or might have thought about it, or were in a position where they could have. And Rick killed them for potential, not action. And here's the counter-argument, the thing that makes this impossible to judge. Maybe Rick's finally being realistic. Maybe Season 1, Rick's mercy and ethics, they were naive. They got Sophia killed, got Dale killed, nearly got everyone killed multiple times. And Season 3, Rick's pragmatism, his willingness to kill preemptively, it's keeping people alive. Carl's safe, Lori's alive, for now. The group's secure in the prison. And that security required Rick to become someone who kills without hesitation, who doesn't give second chances, who'd rather be feared than loved. And maybe that's not good, but maybe it's necessary. Here's what I want to ask you. When does preemptive violence become murder versus protection? Because if Tomas had attacked Rick first, if Rick had killed him in self-defense, we'd call that justified. But Rick killed Tomas before Tomas could attack, based on Rick's judgment that Tomas would attack eventually. And Rick was probably right, but probably isn't certainty. And killing someone for what they probably will do, that's a line. That's Rick playing God, deciding who lives based on his assessment of who's dangerous. And Rick's assessment might be accurate, but it's also Rick taking power that, in his sheriff days, would have belonged to a judge and jury. Rick's appointed himself executioner. And once you give yourself that power, once you decide you can kill based on potential threat rather than actual attack, where's the line? How dangerous does someone have to be before Rick kills them? And who decides? Just Rick? And if Rick's wrong, if he kills someone who wouldn't have actually hurt anyone, who holds Rick accountable? No one, because Rick's in charge. Rick's the law. And Rick's learning that absolute power corrupts even when you start with good intentions, especially then. Season 4 is Rick trying to retire from violence, trying to go back to being good, and learning that the world won't let him. Rick starts Season 4 as a farmer, literally. Rick's given up leadership, given up his gun, and he's farming, growing vegetables, tending pigs, trying to create a peaceful life inside the prison's fences. And Rick's teaching Carl to farm too, trying to give Carl a childhood that isn't just violence and survival. Rick's trying to prove that you can be soft in the apocalypse, that you can choose peace, that goodness is still possible. And it fails. Catastrophically. The governor attacks. The prison falls. Rick's forced to kill again. Forced back into violence. Forced to become the brutal leader he was trying to retire from being. And the lesson is clear. You can retire from violence, but violence won't retire from you. Rick can give up his gun, but threats don't stop existing because Rick's not looking for them. And Rick's softness, his attempt at goodness, nearly gets everyone killed. The evidence is in how quickly Rick abandons farming when crisis hits. The moment the governor threatens the prison, Rick picks up his gun, steps back into leadership, becomes brutal and pragmatic again. Rick's peace was always conditional, always dependent on external safety, and the apocalypse doesn't provide external safety. So Rick's peace was an illusion, a brief fantasy that Rick got to indulge because other people, Daryl, Michonne, the council, were handling the violence Rick was avoiding. The emotional weight is that goodness is a luxury Rick can't afford. Rick wants to be good. Rick wants to farm and teach Carl about crops and create a life that isn't defined by killing. But the world won't let him. Every time Rick softens, every time Rick chooses peace, a threat emerges that requires violence to handle. And Rick's learning that in the apocalypse, goodness equals vulnerability, and vulnerability gets people killed. So Rick has to stay hard, stay ready, stay capable of violence, because the alternative is death. And there's this beautiful, tragic moment in Season 4 where Rick looks at his hands, calloused from farming, and you can see he's proud of them, proud that his hands are building something instead of destroying. And then Rick has to pick up a weapon again, has to kill again, and his hands are covered in blood again. And Rick's looking at them like they've betrayed him, like his hands won't let him be good, like violence is in his DNA now, inescapable. The theory is that Rick tries to go back to being good, fails because the world won't let him, and learns that once you've adapted to apocalypse morality, you can't unadapt. You can't unknow what you know about survival. You can't unfeel the calculation that happens when you meet someone new, assessing threat level, identifying weapons, planning how you'd kill them if you had to. Rick's tried to shut that off, tried to be the man he was before the apocalypse, and his brain won't let him, because that man is dead. That man died in the hospital, or on the farm, or when Rick killed Tomas. In Season 4, Rick is someone new, someone harder, someone who knows too much about violence to ever be fully peaceful again. And the prison falling, the group scattering, Rick and Carl alone on the road, it strips away Rick's illusions. Rick can't farm his way to safety. Rick can't piece his way through the apocalypse. Rick has to be brutal, has to be ready to kill, has to be the monster that keeps Carl alive. And Rick's accepting that, reluctantly, tragically, but accepting it. Here's what keeps me up. Can you retire from violence, or does violence become part of who you are? Because Rick's trying to prove you can retire, you can choose peace, you can step back from brutality, and the world's proving Rick wrong. The world's saying, once you've killed, once you've embraced survival pragmatism, you're changed permanently. You can't go back. You can pretend for a while, can farm and garden and teach your kid about crops, but the moment crisis hits, you'll become the killer again, because that's who you are now. And Rick's learning that goodness isn't just a choice. It's a luxury you can only afford when someone else is doing the violence for you. And when you're alone, when it's just you and your kid on a road full of walkers and hostile survivors, you can't afford goodness. You can only afford survival. And survival requires becoming the thing you'd have hated before the world ended. Season 4, Episode 16, A, is where Rick becomes the monster. It's the clearest, most visceral moment of Rick choosing survival over humanity, and it's brutal to watch. Rick, Carl, and Michonne are captured by the Claimers, Joe's group, and Joe's men are planning to rape Carl and Michonne and make Rick watch before killing him. Joe's got a gun to Rick's head, and Rick's unarmed, hands bound, helpless, and there's no clever plan. No backup, no way out through strategy, just violence. Primal, savage violence. Rick headbutts Joe, gets close enough, and bites into Joe's jugular. Tears his throat out with his teeth, and Joe's dying, choking on his own blood, and Rick's covered in it, spitting out chunks of flesh. And while Joe's dying, Rick's people fight off the other Claimers, and Carl and Michonne survive. But Carl's watching. Carl's seeing his father become an animal, something barely human, something terrifying. And Carl's face in that scene, Chandler Riggs plays it perfectly. Carl's afraid of Rick. Carl's own father terrifies him. And Rick sees it. Rick sees Carl's fear, sees what he's become in Carl's eyes, and Rick's devastated. Andrew Lincoln's performance is gut-wrenching. Rick saved Carl's life, but destroyed Carl's image of him. Carl needed to believe his father was human, was good, was someone worth surviving for. And Rick's just proven he's none of those things. Or all of those things, depending on how you define humanity. Because what Rick did tearing a man's throat out to save his son, is it monstrous? Or is it the most human thing imaginable? A father doing literally anything, becoming literally anything, to protect his child. The emotional anchor is that Rick sacrifices his humanity for Carl's survival, and both are damaged. Carl survives. His body survives. But his innocence, his belief that his father is a good man, that's shattered. And Rick survives. But Rick's sense of self, his belief that there are lines he won't cross, that's gone. Rick's learned that there are no lines, not when Carl's life is at stake. Rick will do anything, become anything, to keep Carl alive. And that's love. Twisted, brutal, barely recognizable, but it's love. The theory is that this is Rick choosing survival over humanity, becoming animal to protect his son. And the question is, does protecting someone you love justify becoming what you'd have hated? Because Rick, pre-apocalypse, would have been horrified by what he does to Joe. Sheriff Rick would have arrested Joe, would have used non-lethal force, would have maintained his humanity even while stopping the threat. But Apocalypse Rick doesn't have that luxury. Apocalypse Rick has seconds to act, no weapons, and the certain knowledge that if he doesn't do something immediately, Carl dies. So Rick does the only thing he can. He becomes a monster. And it works. Carl survives, and Rick has to live with what he became to save him. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that fathers become monsters to protect their children. Rick tears throats. Shane kills Otis to save Carl. The governor burns Woodbury trying to protect Penny's memory. Morgan almost kills Dwayne trying to save him from being like the Walkers. Fatherhood in the apocalypse requires monstrousness, requires a willingness to damn yourself so your child survives. And Rick's joining that pattern. Rick's proving he loves Carl enough to become something Carl will fear. And that's heartbreaking. Here's the question I can't answer. Does protecting someone you love justify becoming what you'd have hated? If the only way to save Carl was to become a monster in Carl's eyes, was Rick right to do it? Because the alternative was Carl dying, or worse, Carl being hurt in ways he couldn't recover from. And Rick prevented that. Rick saved Carl, but the cost was Carl's trust, Carl's belief that his father is good, and Rick's carrying that. You see it in Season 5. Rick and Carl's relationship is strained. Carl looks at Rick differently. Not with the uncomplicated love of a child for a parent, but with wariness, with fear, with the knowledge that his father is capable of incredible violence. And Rick knows Carl's afraid of him. And Rick doesn't know how to fix that. Doesn't know how to be both the protector Carl needs and the good man Carl wants to believe in. And maybe you can't be both. Maybe in the apocalypse, protecting people requires becoming something they'll fear. And you make that trade their safety for their love, and you hope it's worth it. And Rick makes that trade. Rick chooses Carl's survival over Carl's love. And Rick's going to spend years trying to earn that love back, trying to prove to Carl that he's still human underneath the monster. And maybe he succeeds. Or maybe Carl just learns to love the monster. Because Carl doesn't have a choice. Rick's all he has. And in the apocalypse, you love who's left, even when they scare you. Alexandria in Season 5 is a mirror showing Rick who he's become. The Alexandria safe zone accepts Rick's group at the end of Season 5, and its civilization. Walls, houses, running water, jobs, community structure, pre-apocalypse life, preserved, and Rick's group doesn't fit. They're too hard, too violent, too adapted to survival. And the Alexandrians are terrified of them, especially Rick. Rick's confrontation with Pete in Season 5's finale is the clearest example. Pete's abusing his wife Jessie and his son Ron, and Rick wants to stop it, which is good, right? Rick's protecting an abuse victim. Rick's doing the right thing, but Rick's method is wrong. Rick threatens Pete publicly, waves a gun around, shouts at Deanna and the Alexandrians about how they're weak and naive and they're all going to die because they won't do what's necessary. And Rick's right about Pete. Pete is dangerous, needs to be stopped. But Rick's approach, his willingness to execute Pete immediately rather than trying nonviolent intervention first, it horrifies Alexandria. They see Rick as a threat, as someone barely more civilized than the walkers outside the walls. And the scene where Rick almost gets exiled, where Deanna's considering sending Rick's group away, it's because Alexandria can't reconcile Rick's violence with their attempt to rebuild civilization. Rick's violence is effective. Rick's right that Pete's dangerous, but Rick's also scaring people, making them feel unsafe in their own community, and Rick doesn't understand why. Rick thinks he's protecting them. Rick thinks His willingness to do what's necessary makes him the hero, and to Alexandria, Rick's the villain. The emotional anchor is that Rick's goodness is now violence. Rick can't separate protecting from threatening. Rick's definition of keeping people safe requires eliminating threats, and Rick sees threats everywhere. Pete's a threat. The Alexandrians who disagree with Rick are threats. Anyone who might challenge Rick's authority, anyone who might endanger his people, they're threats. And Rick wants them dealt with permanently. And that's not protection, that's tyranny. And Rick doesn't see the difference anymore. The evidence is in how Rick talks about Alexandria. Rick tells Carol something like, "These people are weak. They've been lucky. And when their luck runs out, we'll have to take this place." Rick's not planning to integrate. Rick's planning to conquer. Rick's seeing Alexandria not as a community to join, but as a resource to control. And that's not the Rick who woke up in the hospital. That's not the sheriff who believed in protecting people, serving people. This is a Rick who believes in controlling people for their own good. And the Alexandrians see it. They see Rick looking at them like they're sheep needing a shepherd or a tyrant, and they're right to be afraid. And then Rick kills Pete. Season 5 finale. Pete attacks Deanna's husband Reg with Michonne's sword, kills him, and Rick shoots Pete in the head. Immediate execution. No trial. No process. Just Rick deciding Pete's a threat and eliminating him. And it's justified by any practical standard. Pete just murdered someone, was clearly dangerous. But it's also Rick acting as judge, jury, and executioner. Rick taking power that, in a functioning society, wouldn't belong to one man. And Deanna, grieving her husband, she tells Rick to do it. She gives Rick permission, but giving Rick that power, letting Rick kill Pete, it sets a precedent. It tells Rick that Alexandria will let him be violent, will let him kill, as long as Rick's killing the right people. And who decides who the right people are? Rick does, and that's dangerous. The theory is that Alexandria shows Rick who he's become too violent for civilized society. Rick's adapted so completely to apocalypse survival that he can't reintegrate into civilization. Rick sees threats Alexandria doesn't see, reacts with violence Alexandria finds excessive, and can't understand why they won't just let him do what's necessary. And Rick's not entirely wrong. Alexandria is naive, sheltered, lucky. They're about to learn how dangerous the world is. But Rick's also not right, because Rick's solution to every problem is violence, and you can't build a civilization on violence. You can't create a community where people feel safe if the person protecting them makes them feel afraid. Here's what Alexandria is asking. Who is Rick Grimes? And the answer terrifies them. Rick's the man who'll protect you by killing anyone who threatens you. And that's reassuring until you realize, what if Rick decides you're the threat? What if you disagree with Rick, challenge Rick, question Rick's methods? Does Rick kill you too? And the Alexandrians don't know. And Rick doesn't know. And that uncertainty, that fear that Rick might turn his violence on anyone, even allies, it makes Rick more dangerous than protective. And Rick's learning that you can be so good at violence that people can't tell if you're protecting them or threatening them. And maybe there's no difference anymore. Maybe Rick's protection and Rick's threats are the same thing. And maybe that's what monsters are. People who can't separate helping from hurting. Season 6 into Season 7 is where The Walking Dead asks us to see Rick as the villain. And it's uncomfortable and brilliant. Rick's group attacks the Savior's compound in Season 6, Episode 12, Not Tomorrow Yet, killing dozens of sleeping people. And here's the thing. Rick initiates this. Negan hasn't attacked Alexandria yet. Negan hasn't even threatened them directly. The Hilltop tells Rick about Negan, says Negan's extorting communities, and Rick decides to preemptively attack. Rick's group sneaks into the Savior's compound at night and executes sleeping people. No warning, no negotiation, just massacre. And from Rick's perspective, This makes sense. Negan's dangerous. Negan will eventually threaten Alexandria. Better to strike first, eliminate the threat before it materializes. But from Negan's perspective, from the Savior's perspective, Rick's the aggressor. Rick's the one who attacked first. Rick's the one who killed their friends, their family, their people. And Negan's response, capturing Rick's people, killing Glenn and Abraham, that's retaliation. That's Negan responding to Rick's violence with more violence. And the show's asking us to sit with the discomfort of, Rick started this. Rick escalated this. Rick's the reason Glenn's dead. And that's hard to accept. We've been following Rick for 6 seasons. We love Rick, trust Rick, want Rick to succeed. But the show's forcing us to see that Rick's methods, Rick's preemptive violence, they have consequences. Glenn dies because Rick attacked the Saviors. Abraham dies because Rick attacked the Saviors. And Rick didn't have to attack. Rick chose to. And that choice killed his friends. The emotional weight is that Rick's violence created the situation that killed people he loved. Rick's trying to protect his community, yes. Rick's trying to eliminate threats before they become problems, yes. But Rick's also playing God, deciding who's too dangerous to exist and killing them preemptively. And Rick's wrong sometimes. The Saviors weren't planning to attack Alexandria. They didn't know Alexandria existed. And Rick's attack made Negan notice them, made Negan retaliate, made Negan kill Glenn and Abraham to teach Rick a lesson. And Rick has to carry that. Rick has to know that his decision, his violence, it got his friends killed. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that perspective matters. Heroes and villains depend on whose story you're hearing. From Rick's perspective, he's protecting his people by eliminating threats. He's the hero. From Negan's perspective, Rick attacked first, killed Negan's people unprovoked, and Negan's just defending his community and enforcing consequences. Negan's the hero. And both perspectives are valid. Both are true simultaneously. And the show's refusing to say one is right and the other wrong. It's just showing violence, begetting violence, escalation, creating escalation, and nobody winning. And here's the question that haunts me. If Negan told this story, would Rick be the bad guy? If we started with Negan's perspective, saw Rick's group sneak into the compound and massacre sleeping people, saw Negan grieving his friends and swearing revenge, would we root for Negan? Would we call Rick the villain? Because by any objective standard, Rick committed the first act of war. Rick killed first. Negan's just responding. And Negan's response is brutal, disproportionate, traumatizing, but it's also understandable. Negan's teaching Rick that violence has consequences, that you can't just kill people without retaliation. And Negan's method killing 2 of Rick's people to balance the scales, it's horrific. But it's also logical by apocalypse standards. Eye for an eye, blood for blood, and Rick's broken by this. Season 7, Rick is beaten, traumatized, subservient to Negan. And Rick's learning what it feels like to be on the receiving end of violence, to have someone more powerful than you inflict horror just because they can. And Rick's hated it. Rick's been desperate to escape Negan's control, to fight back, to kill Negan. And Rick doesn't see the irony, that Rick did the same thing to the Saviors. Rick was the powerful one, inflicting violence on a weaker group just because Rick decided they were too dangerous to live. And Rick's experiencing what that feels like from the other side. The theory is that Rick's the villain from Negan's perspective, and the show's forcing us to sit with that, to admit that Rick's not always right, not always justified, not always the hero. Sometimes Rick's the monster. Sometimes Rick's the threat. And recognizing that doesn't mean Rick's bad. It just means Rick's human, flawed, capable of terrible judgment. And in the apocalypse, terrible judgment gets people killed. And Rick's judgment killed Glenn and Abraham. And Rick has to live with that. And we have to live with loving a character who's capable of being the villain in someone else's story. And maybe that's what growing up means in the apocalypse, realizing that everyone's the hero of their own story, and the villain of someone else's, and Rick's both, simultaneously, and neither. And accepting that ambiguity is harder than judging Rick as good or bad, but it's more honest. Carl's death in Season 8 is the show's judgment on Rick's violence. That's how I read it, anyway. Carl dies from a walker bite in Episode 9, bitten while helping Sadiq, a stranger Carl's bringing into the community. And Carl's doing exactly what Rick taught him. Help people, build community, trust strangers enough to give them a chance. Carl's embodying the best parts of Rick's Season 1 morality. And Carl dies from it. And Carl's final act, his last request to Rick before he dies, is to stop the war with Negan, to make peace, to prove that the world can be more than endless violence. And that's devastating for Rick. Rick spent Season 7 and most of Season 8 at war with Negan, consumed by violence and revenge and the certainty that Negan has to die. Rick's become exactly what Carl's asking him not to be, a man defined by violence, unable to see past killing to any other solution. And Carl, dying, is asking Rick to be better, to choose peace, to honor Carl's sacrifice by becoming the man Carl needed him to be, not the man Rick's become. The emotional anchor is that Rick's own child is telling him he's not good anymore. Carl's not saying it directly, maybe. But Carl's letters, Carl's dying wish, their implicit criticism of Rick's choices. Carl saying, the violence, the war, the brutality, it doesn't work. It just creates more violence. And Carl's asking Rick to break the cycle, to choose mercy over revenge, to be the father Carl believed Rick could be. And Rick's devastated, because Carl's right. Rick's war with Negan, Rick's obsession with killing Negan, it's consumed Rick, made Rick into someone Carl doesn't recognize. And Carl's telling Rick, this isn't who you're supposed to be. And Rick's realizing Carl's right, and Carl's dying, and Rick can't fix it, can't save him, can only honor Carl's wish. The theory is that Carl's death is narrative judgment on Rick's violence, because Carl dies helping someone, doing the thing Rick taught him to do, being good and hopeful and human. And Carl's final act is asking Rick to be those things too. To stop being the violent warlord Rick's become and start being the good man Rick was, the man who woke up in a hospital and apologized to a Walker child before shooting her. And Carl believes Rick can do it. Carl believes Rick's still in there, underneath the violence and the trauma. And Carl's asking Rick to find that man again, to be good again, even if it's harder, even if it costs more. Because the alternative, being the violent man Rick's become, it cost Carl. And Carl's asking, was it worth it? And Rick doesn't have an answer. And Rick tries. Rick tries to honor Carl's wish. In Season 8's finale, Rick slits Negan's throat, but doesn't kill him. Imprisons him instead. Tries to create the peace Carl asked for. And it works. Kind of. The communities unite. The war ends. But it costs Rick everything. Maggie won't forgive him for sparing Negan. Daryl's conflicted. Michonne supports Rick, but at great personal cost. And Rick's alienated from the people he's fought with, fought for, because Rick's choosing Carl's vision over their need for justice. And Rick's okay with that, because honoring Carl matters more than anything else, more than being right, more than being loved, more than surviving. Carl asked Rick to be good, and Rick's trying, even though it's destroying him. Here's the question that breaks my heart. If your dying son asks you to change, were you ever right? Because Carl's not just asking Rick to spare Negan. Carl's asking Rick to admit that everything Rick's done, all the violence and brutality in war, it was wrong. Or at least, it wasn't the only way. Carl's proving that another way is possible. Help people, trust people, build instead of destroy, and Carl's asking Rick to try that way. And Rick's realizing that maybe he should have tried Carl's way all along. That maybe if Rick had been less violent, less paranoid, less willing to kill first and ask questions never, maybe Carl would still be alive. Maybe Glenn and Abraham would still be alive. Maybe the war wouldn't have happened at all. And Rick can't know, can't rewind, can only move forward, carrying Carl's letters, trying to be the man Carl believed Rick could be, and it's too late for Carl. But maybe it's not too late for Rick. Maybe Rick can still change, still become good again, still honor Carl's memory by building the peaceful world Carl wanted. And that's what Season 9 Rick is trying to do. Build bridges, literally and metaphorically. Unite communities. Create peace. And Rick's doing it for Carl. Doing it because Carl asked him to. And maybe that's what goodness is in the apocalypse. Not being good from the start, but choosing to become good even after you've been the monster. Even after you've failed. Even after your son dies, asking you to be better. You try anyway, because what else is there? What else can you do but honor the people you've lost by being who they needed you to be, even if it's too late for them to see it? Season 9, Episode 5, Rick's final episode, is where Rick chooses others over himself. Finally, completely, without calculation. Rick's trying to lead a walker horde away from the communities, and Rick's injured, impaled on rebar, barely conscious. And Rick could run. Rick could find a horse, escape, save himself. But the walkers are heading toward the communities, toward the bridge where everyone's working, where Daryl and Carol and Michonne and everyone Rick loves are vulnerable, and Rick chooses to blow the bridge. Rick detonates the explosives, destroys the bridge and the horde, and the explosion nearly kills him. And from Rick's perspective, it probably does kill him. Rick doesn't know the CRM will save him. Rick thinks he's dying, and Rick's okay with that, because everyone else survives. And that sacrifice, that choice, it's the first truly good act Rick's committed in years. Not good because it's non-violent, Rick's killing hundreds of walkers. But good because it's selfless. Rick gains nothing. Rick loses everything. His life, his family, his future. And Rick does it anyway because saving his family matters more than surviving. And that's what goodness is, maybe. Not refusing to do violence, but refusing to let others die when you can prevent it, even if prevention costs your life. The emotional weight is massive. Rick's thinking about Carl's letters asking for peace and community and hope, and Rick's honoring that by saving the communities, preserving the peace, protecting the future Carl wanted. Rick's thinking about Judith and RJ, his children who'll grow up without him, but will grow up safe because Rick made this choice. Rick's thinking about Michonne and Daryl and everyone he's fought alongside, fought for, hurt and saved and failed and protected. And Rick's choosing them, all of them, over himself. And that's love. That's redemption. If Rick needs redeeming, that's the good man from Season 1, the one who apologized to walkers and believed in protecting people, making one final appearance. And Rick's hands, the motif we started with, they're covered in blood on that bridge. Rick's hands have been tools of violence for 9 seasons. They've killed Shane, killed Tomas, killed the Saviors, torn Joe's throat. Rick's hands are weapons, symbols of Rick's brutality. And on the bridge, Rick's hands are pressing the detonator. One final act of violence that saves everyone. And then the explosion, and Rick's hands go limp, and Rick thinks he's dying having finally done something purely good, something without calculation or pragmatism, just sacrifice. The theory is that Rick's sacrifice is his first truly good act in years, because everything else Rick's done, even the protective acts, they've had calculation. Rick killed to keep Carl safe. Rick fought wars to protect his community. Rick made peace to honor Carl. But the bridge, that's different. That's Rick with no future, no stake in the outcome, choosing to save people because they matter. Not because Rick will benefit, not because Rick's protecting his family, but because people deserve to be saved, even if Rick's not there to see it. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that goodness requires self-sacrifice, not survival. Characters who try to be good while also surviving, they compromise. They make brutal choices. They hurt people to protect other people. But characters who sacrifice themselves, Dale, Herschel, Beth, Carl, Rick, they get to be good fully, without compromise, because they're not surviving to face the consequences. They're just doing the right thing and accepting that it'll cost them everything. And there's something beautiful and terrible about that. Beautiful because it's pure goodness, no strings attached. Terrible because it requires dying to achieve. And Rick doesn't die. The CRM saves him, takes him, and Rick spends years trying to get back to his family, and that's its own tragedy. Because Rick made the good choice, the selfless choice, and Rick's reward is being taken away from everything he loves, imprisoned by the CRM, separated from Judith and Michonne, and everyone. Rick's sacrifice was real, but Rick doesn't get to rest, doesn't get to die having done the right thing. Rick has to keep surviving, keep fighting, keep being Rick. And maybe that's the real punishment for Rick's violence in seasons 3 to 7. Not death, but survival without the people he survived for. Here's what I think. Rick was good when he stopped trying to survive and started trying to save. When Rick's goals shifted from keep my family alive at any cost to keep everyone alive, even if it costs me, that's when Rick became good again. Not good like season 1 Rick, naive and idealistic, but good in a deeper way. Good because Rick understands the cost of violence, understands what he's become, and chooses to be better anyway. Chooses to honor Carl's wish even though it's harder. Chooses to sacrifice himself even though he'd rather survive to see Judith grow up. Rick becomes good by accepting that being good requires loss. And Rick chooses goodness anyway, and that's redemption. Or it would be, if the world let Rick rest. But the world doesn't, and Rick's still out there, still fighting, still trying to get back to being the good man his family remembers. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Keep trying. Keep choosing goodness, even when it costs us, even when we fail, especially then. So let's step back and look at Rick's entire arc, from sheriff to bridge, and let's ask the central question. Was Rick ever good by traditional morality, or did the apocalypse just require a different definition of goodness? Because I think the answer is both. Rick was good in season 1 by pre-outbreak standards, compassionate, ethical, reluctant to use violence. But pre-outbreak standards don't work in the apocalypse. They get people killed. So Rick adapted, became more violent, more pragmatic, more willing to kill to protect. And by apocalypse standards, by the ethics of survival, Rick's still good. Rick's protecting people. Rick's keeping communities alive. Rick's making the hard calls nobody else can make. The methods are brutal, but the outcome is people surviving who wouldn't otherwise. And here's where it gets complicated. Rick's violence kept people alive, but Rick's mercy got people killed. Think about it. Every time Rick chose mercy, chose to spare someone or give someone a second chance, people died. Rick spared the Terminus survivors initially. They attacked again. Rick didn't kill Pete immediately. Pete killed Reg. Rick trusted the Saviors to honor the deal after Negan's defeat, and conflicts continued. Rick's mercy, his attempts to be good by season 1 standards, they failed. They got people he loved killed. But Rick's violence also got people killed. Rick's attack on the Saviors got Glenn and Abraham killed. Rick's war with Negan got Carl bitten indirectly. Carl dies, helping someone, being the good person. Rick's war was preventing Rick from being. Rick's brutality in Season 3 almost got him exiled from the prison group. Rick's violence protects people short-term, but creates enemies and conflicts that kill people long-term. So Rick's violence fails too, just differently. The emotional anchor is that goodness and effectiveness are opposites in the apocalypse, or they seem to be. Rick can be good, merciful, compassionate, ethical, and get people killed. Or Rick can be effective, brutal, pragmatic, violent, and keep people alive but lose his humanity. And Rick's trying to find a balance, trying to be both good and effective, and learning that maybe you can't. Maybe the apocalypse requires choosing, and whichever you choose, you lose something essential. The question that's haunted this entire exploration is a good man who gets people killed better than a bad man who keeps them alive? And I don't think The Walking Dead answers that. I think it just shows us Rick trying both, failing at both, and having to live with the consequences of both. Dale was good, died arguing for mercy. Shane was effective, died because his methods alienated everyone. And Rick's trying to be both, and Rick's surviving, but at massive cost. Rick's alive, but he's lost Lori, lost Carl, lost years with Judith and RJ, lost his sense of self. And the people Rick's kept alive, Daryl, Carol, Maggie, Michonne, they're alive, but traumatized, broken by the choices they've had to make following Rick's lead. The theory is that Rick was never good by traditional morality, but maybe the apocalypse requires a new definition. Maybe goodness post-outbreak isn't about refusing to do violence. Maybe it's about doing violence only when necessary, protecting people even when it costs you, building community despite the constant threats, and choosing hope even when hope seems impossible. And by that definition, Rick's good. Rick protects people. Rick builds communities. Rick chose to honor Carl's wish for peace even when it was harder, cost more, alienated people Rick cared about. Rick sacrificed himself on the bridge to save communities that would have fallen without him. That's good. Maybe not good by sheriff standards, but good by apocalypse standards. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe Rick was good, just differently. Rick adapted his morality to fit the world he was in, and that adaptation looked like brutality from the outside, but was actually compassion. Rick killed to protect. Rick fought wars to create peace. Rick became the monster so his children didn't have to, and that's good. Twisted, painful, barely recognizable as goodness, but it's what goodness looks like when the world's ended and you're just trying to keep people alive one more day. Or maybe Rick was never good. Maybe Rick's just a man who did terrible things for understandable reasons, and we're calling it goodness because we love him, because we followed his journey, because we want to believe the protagonist is the hero. Maybe Rick's the villain of someone else's story, and we're just too close to see it. Maybe goodness and badness don't apply to apocalypse survivors. Maybe there's just people trying to survive, making impossible choices, hurting people they don't want to hurt, and hoping it means something. And Rick's that. Rick's a man trying his best in impossible circumstances, failing constantly, succeeding occasionally, and carrying the weight of every choice. Good or bad feels almost irrelevant. Rick's just Rick. Broken, violent, compassionate, brutal, loving, terrifying, human. And maybe that's enough. Let's talk about the people Rick saved, because that's how some people measure goodness, by outcomes, by consequences, by who's alive because of your choices. And Rick's ledger, if we're measuring it that way, it's impressive. Judith's alive. RJ's alive. Daryl, Carol, Maggie, Michonne, they're all alive. Alexandria survived. Hilltop survived. The community's united. And all of that, all of those lives, they exist because Rick made brutal choices that kept people alive. Rick killed threats. Rick fought wars. Rick became the monster that stood between his people and everything trying to kill them. And it worked. His people survived. The theory from this perspective is that Rick's goodness is measured by who survived, not how Rick made them survive. Consequentialist ethics say that an action's morality is determined by its outcomes. And Rick's outcomes are good. People are alive. Communities are functioning. Children are growing up in relative safety. And Rick's the reason for all of that. Rick's violence, brutal as it was, protected people who'd be dead under more merciful leadership. Dale's mercy got Dale killed. Herschel's compassion got Herschel killed. Rick's pragmatism kept Rick alive long enough to save dozens, hundreds of people. And there's something compelling about that argument. Because in the apocalypse, survival is the first moral imperative. You can't be good if you're dead. You can't help anyone if you're a walker. So staying alive, keeping your people alive, that's foundational. And Rick did that better than almost anyone. Rick's the reason Alexandria isn't a ruin. Rick's the reason the saviors were defeated. Rick's the reason the communities have any hope of rebuilding civilization. And if we measure goodness by lives saved, by positive outcomes, Rick's good. Rick's a hero. Rick's the man who kept everyone alive when everything was trying to kill them. And the people Rick saved, they'd agree. Judith loves Rick, remembers him as a hero who sacrificed himself for everyone. Daryl credits Rick with teaching him to be part of a family. Carol trusts Rick's judgment even when it costs her. Michonne followed Rick's example, led Alexandria the way Rick would have wanted. And these people, they're not naive. They've seen Rick at his worst. They've watched Rick kill people, make brutal calls, become the monster. And they still believe Rick's good. They still trust Rick's judgment. They still honor Rick's memory. And their belief in Rick, their love for Rick despite his violence, maybe that's evidence Rick was good all along. The evidence that Rick's methods worked is in the communities that survived. Alexandria, Hilltop, the Kingdom, until it fell, Oceanside, they all exist because Rick united them, taught them to fight, gave them hope that survival was possible. And the people in those communities, they're living lives that resemble pre-outbreak normalcy. Children go to school. Adults have jobs. People fall in love, have families, plan for the future. And that's only possible because Rick made the brutal choices that created space for those normal lives. Rick did the violence so others didn't have to. Rick carried the moral weight so others could stay clean. And that's a kind of goodness. That's sacrifice. That's Rick damning himself so others could be saved. Here's the argument for Rick's goodness. Consequentialist ethics say Rick's good because his actions had good results. Rick saved more people than he killed. Rick protected more lives than he destroyed. Rick built more than he tore down. And in the apocalypse, where resources are scarce and threats are constant, that's miraculous. Rick's a net positive for humanity's survival. And if goodness is measured by outcomes, Rick's good. Rick's very good. Rick's one of the best. But there is a counter-argument, and we need to sit with it. Because consequentialism is dangerous. Consequentialism is the ethics the CRM uses, kill thousands to save millions. Consequentialism justifies any violence as long as the outcome is good. And Rick's consequentialism, Rick's belief that brutal means are justified by survival outcomes, it cost Rick his humanity. It cost Rick his son. It cost Rick years with his family. And maybe those costs matter as much as the benefits. Maybe Rick saving 100 people doesn't erase Rick killing 10. Maybe both are true. Rick saved people and Rick hurt people. And we have to hold both truths simultaneously without resolving them into a simple good or bad. And the people Rick saved, they're alive. but they're also traumatized, broken, carrying the weight of what they had to do to survive under Rick's leadership. Daryl's isolated, struggling with human connection. Carol's had mental breakdowns from the killing. Maggie's consumed by rage over Glenn. Michonne left her children to search for Rick. These people survived, yes. But survival isn't the same as thriving. Survival isn't the same as being okay. And Rick's methods kept them alive, but at a cost to their mental health, their relationships, their ability to be happy. And that cost, that collateral damage to people's souls, does it matter? Or does staying alive justify any emotional cost? And I don't know the answer. I just know that Rick saved people, and Rick damaged people, and both are true, and Rick has to live with both. And we have to decide if that makes Rick good or not. And maybe there's no one answer. Maybe it depends on who you ask. Now let's talk about the people Rick failed, because the ledger has two sides. Lori's dead. Shane's dead. Herschel, Glenn, Abraham, Carl, all dead under Rick's leadership. And some of those deaths, Rick didn't directly cause. Lori died in childbirth. Herschel was executed by the governor. But Rick's choices contributed. Rick's war with the governor got Herschel killed. Rick's attack on the saviors got Glenn and Abraham killed. Rick's inability to find peace earlier got Carl bitten. While Carl was trying to be the good person, Rick's violence was preventing Rick from being, and Rick has to carry those deaths. Rick has to know that his methods, effective as they were for some people, failed catastrophically for others. The theory from this perspective is that Rick's failures show that even pragmatic violence doesn't guarantee success. Rick tried to keep everyone alive. Rick made brutal choices specifically to protect people. And people died anyway. Not because Rick was too merciful, because the world's too dangerous, too random, too hostile for anyone to guarantee anyone else's safety. And Rick's learning that the hard way. Learning that you can be as violent and pragmatic as Shane wanted, and people still die. You can kill all the threats, and new threats emerge. You can win every war, and peace still eludes you. And Rick's carrying the weight of every failure, every person he couldn't save, every choice that backfired. And the people Rick failed, they haunt him. Rick hallucinates Lori in Season 3, sees her ghost, talks to her on a phantom phone. Rick carries Shane's memory, the guilt of killing his best friend, the knowledge that Shane was right about so many things. Rick reads Carl's letters obsessively, trying to honor Carl's wishes, trying to be the father Carl asked him to be, even though Carl's gone. Rick's relationships with the survivors are defined by the people who aren't there. Maggie can't forgive Rick for sparing Negan because Glenn's death is always between them. Carol and Rick's friendship is strained by memories of Sophia and Lizzie. Michonne and Rick's love is complicated by Carl's absence. The dead are more present than the living in Rick's life. And that's the cost of Rick's failures. Not just that people died, but that Rick can't let them go, can't forgive himself, can't move forward without their ghosts following. The evidence that Rick's methods don't guarantee success is in how many people died despite Rick's violence. Rick killed the governor's soldiers, and the governor attacked again, killed Herschel. Rick attacked the saviors, and Negan retaliated, killed Glenn and Abraham. Rick fought the Whisperers, and Alpha killed people anyway, put heads on pikes. Every enemy Rick eliminates is replaced by a new enemy. Every war Rick wins creates the conditions for the next war. And Rick's learning that violence doesn't end violence. Violence just creates cycles. And Rick's trapped in those cycles, trying to break them and constantly failing. The counter theory here is that maybe Rick wasn't good OR effective. Maybe Rick was just desperate. Desperate to keep Carl safe. Desperate to protect Lori. Desperate to hold on to the people he loved. And Rick's desperation looked like pragmatism, looked like brutal effectiveness, but it was really just fear. Fear of losing everyone. fear of being alone, fear of failing the people who depended on him. And Rick's choices, born from that fear, they worked sometimes and failed sometimes and had no consistent pattern because fear isn't a strategy. Fear's just fear. And Rick was afraid every day of the apocalypse, and Rick's choices reflected that fear. And calling those choices good or bad misses the point. They were just the choices of a terrified man trying not to lose the people he loved. And he lost them anyway, because fear doesn't protect you, and violence doesn't save you. And Rick's learning that you can be the most brutal, most pragmatic, most effective leader in the apocalypse, and people still die, and all you can do is carry them, carry their memories, their wishes, their ghosts, and hope that you honored them well enough. Here's the question that breaks me. If Rick's methods cost him everyone he loved, were they worth it? Lori died while Rick was securing the prison. Carl died while Rick was at war with Negan. Rick lost years with Judith and RJ because Rick sacrificed himself on the bridge. Rick's alive, yes, and Rick saved communities, yes, but Rick's separated from everyone he was trying to protect. Rick's alone, or was alone until the ones who live, and the people Rick loved, they're gone or they're living without him. And does that make Rick's choices wrong? Or does it just make them tragic? Because Rick tried. Rick did everything he could. Rick became the monster, made the impossible choices, sacrificed pieces of himself over and over, and it wasn't enough. And maybe that's the real lesson, that trying isn't enough, that violence isn't enough, that pragmatism isn't enough. Sometimes people die anyway, and all you can do is survive them and hope you honored them well enough that their memory makes your survival meaningful. And Rick's doing that, carrying Carl's letters, trying to get back to Judith, honoring the people he failed by being better for the people who remain. And maybe that's all goodness is in the apocalypse, not succeeding at protecting everyone, but trying despite knowing you'll fail. And loving the people you lose enough to keep trying for the ones who remain. So here we are, at the final question, the one that's been hovering over this entire exploration, good versus alive. That's the central tension of The Walking Dead, the impossible choice the show's been asking us to sit with for 11 seasons. Do you be good and die, or do you survive by compromising your goodness? And Rick represents that choice embodied. Rick tried to be good in Season 1, and it failed. Rick tried to be purely pragmatic in Seasons 3 to 7, and it cost him his humanity. Rick tried to balance both in Seasons 8 to 9, and it cost him his son and his freedom. And the show's refusing to say which choice is right. It's just showing us the costs of each and asking us to figure out what we'd choose. The evidence is in the characters who stayed good versus the characters who compromised. Dale stayed good, compassionate, ethical, unwilling to kill. And Dale died in Season 2, killed by a walker, never seeing whether his philosophy would have worked long term. Herschel stayed good, maintained his faith, his compassion, his belief that people were worth saving. And the governor executed Herschel in front of everyone, used Herschel's goodness against him. Beth stayed good, hopeful, caring, trying to maintain her humanity, and Beth was shot in the head at Grady Memorial. Carl stayed good, helped Sadiq, wrote letters asking for peace, believed people could be better, and Carl died from a walker bite, asking Rick to honor his goodness by being good too. And the characters who compromised, who became more brutal and pragmatic, they survived longer. Shane survived until his brutality alienated Rick, and Rick killed him. The governor survived until his monstrousness created so many enemies they overwhelmed him. Negan survived by being brutal, then survived longer by changing, by becoming less brutal. Rick survived by compromising, by becoming more like Shane and less like Dale. Carol survived by becoming someone willing to burn people alive. Daryl survived by isolating, by being ready to kill anyone who threatened his family. The pattern is clear. Goodness gets you killed in the apocalypse. Compromise keeps you alive. But compromise costs your humanity, costs your soul, costs the thing that makes life worth living. And the show's asking, which is worse, dying good or living compromised? And the answer depends on who you ask. Dale would say, dying good is better. You lived according to your values, stayed human until the end, died with dignity. Rick would say, living compromised is better. You kept people alive, protected your family, sacrificed yourself so others could have a future. And both are valid, both are true, and both are heartbreaking. The emotional anchor is that Rick's alive but haunted, and Carl's dead but remembered as good. And which would you choose? Would you rather be Rick alive, separated from family, carrying the weight of decades of violence and trauma, knowing you compromised every value you started with but kept people alive? Or would you rather be Carl dead at 18, but died helping someone, died being good, died asking people to be better? And there's no easy answer. Both choices have value. Both choices have cost. And whichever you choose, you lose something essential. The theory is that Rick represents the impossible choice. Be good and die, or survive by losing your goodness. And Rick chose survival. Rick chose to compromise, to become brutal, to lose pieces of himself so others could live. And Rick's alive. Rick saved communities. Rick gave people a future. But Rick's also lost everyone he loved, spent years imprisoned by the CRM. He can't look in a mirror without seeing a monster. And was it worth it? Ask Rick, and he'd probably say yes. Ask Carl, and he'd probably say no. And both would be right. The show's pattern is that The Walking Dead never answers whether goodness matters. It just shows the cost of choosing it and the cost of abandoning it, and leaves viewers to decide which cost they can live with. Because that's the question, really. Not, is it better to be good or to survive? But, which cost can you live with? Can you live with dying young, having failed to protect people, but knowing you stayed human until the end? Or can you live with surviving decades, becoming something you hate, but knowing your brutality kept people alive? And there's no universal answer. There's just your answer, the cost you can carry, the weight you can hold. Here's my final question for you. What's the point of surviving if you become something you'd have hated before? If survival requires killing without hesitation, lying without guilt, betraying without remorse, then what are you surviving for? Just to keep breathing? Just to not die? Is that enough? And for some people, yes. For Rick, yes. Rick will become anything, do anything, lose any piece of himself, if it means Judith and RJ survive. Rick's survival has a purpose protecting his children, and that purpose justifies any compromise. But for Carl, no. Carl would rather die being good than survive being brutal. Carl's goodness has meaning beyond survival, has value that doesn't depend on living to see tomorrow. And Carl died defending that value, and Rick surviving honoring that value. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe it's not be good or survive. Maybe it's be good when you can, survive when you must, and honor the people who died being good by trying to be better than you are. And Rick's doing that. Rick's carrying Carl's letters. Rick's trying to get back to Judith. Rick's honoring the good people he's lost by being the best version of himself he can be, even though that version is flawed and violent and traumatized. Rick's not good. Rick's probably never been fully good, but Rick's trying, and maybe that's enough. Maybe goodness isn't about being perfect. Maybe it's about trying despite knowing you'll fail. Maybe it's about loving people enough to become a monster for them, then hating yourself enough to try being human again. Maybe Rick was never good. Maybe Rick was always good. Maybe good is the wrong measure for someone who spent a decade in hell, making impossible choices and hoping they meant something. Maybe Rick's just Rick. Human, flawed, violent, loving, trying. And maybe that's all any of us are in the apocalypse. Just people trying to be better than we were yesterday, failing constantly, succeeding occasionally, and hoping that the people we love remember us as someone worth loving. And Rick's that. And Carl saw that. And maybe that's what goodness is. Not perfection. Just trying. Just loving. Just being human despite everything trying to make you a monster. And Rick's that. He always has been. Thanks for staying with me on this one. If Rick's journey got you thinking about what it means to be good when the world's gone to hell, I'd really appreciate a like. It helps these late-night theory explorations find other people who can't stop thinking about these characters. Also, drop your location in the comments. I'm curious where you're watching from. There's something comforting about knowing we're all in different parts of the world at different times of night, but sitting with the same impossible questions about the same broken, beautiful characters. Sleep well. And remember, Rick Grimes was never perfect. He was just a man trying to be good in a world that kept punishing goodness. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Try, fail, try again. And hope it means something. Sweet dreams.